In every corner of this country, young lives are being lost to the criminal justice system. This is the story of juveniles in prison, a journey into the world of those who have fallen through the cracks of society. Inside these walls, young people face a harsh reality. Many come from broken homes, surrounded by violence and poverty. For them, prison is not just a punishment, but a continuation of the struggles they face on the outside. Willie Bosket was a broken child from a broken home. The system failed him, time after time again, and eventually, at 15 years old, he couldn't put himself back together. Bosket shot and killed 2 people in the subway, injuring a third. Following this tragic event, the Juvenile Offender Act was passed in 1978, allowing children as young as 13 years old to be prosecuted as adults within the courts. Currently, an estimated 250,000 youth are tried, sentenced, or incarcerated as adults every year across the United States. This needs to stop. Prison is no place for a child.
In order to make this documentary, I was able to interview several professionals. Voices may have been changed and faces removed in order to protect privacy and conceal further identification markers. What is your name?
Amy Hoagland.
What do you do for work?
I am a LIS, Licensed Independent Social Worker. I am a master's level clinical therapist. I have been providing therapy services for over 17 years. I own my own practice, and I am contracted as a school-based therapist. I specialize in childhood trauma, with emphasis on symptoms of attachment, dysregulation of the nervous system, depression, and anxiety. I am also a consultant for trauma-informed care in the school system. I educate staff on creating a safe environment for students so they can work at their best potential academically, physically, and emotionally.
Through your job, have you dealt with youth who have had interaction with law enforcement? If so, what are some general reasons for their interaction? Have any of these minors been to jail, prison, etc.?
I would say about 20% of the clients I see have had some contact with the law. This can range from driving without a license to drug or assault charges.
What impact can prison have on the mental health of children? Does this negatively impact them or positively impact them? And if so, in what ways?
In my experience, imprisonment of youth has a huge impact on the minor. In most cases, this is in a negative way. They can be negatively impacted by isolation, creating bonds with other inmates that may result in more run-ins with the law, getting behind academically, living in a survival state for long periods of time, and charges that may impact the individual in the future. As far as mental health goes, imprisonment can increase trauma responses, including anxiety, depression, and a dysregulated nervous system which can result in hypervigilant state of fight or flight to survive.
Amy was one of the various professionals I contacted to learn more about youth imprisonment. My time talking with her helped me to understand the true mental health impact of prison on these children. In order to protect the children against grown adults, many times these kids are put into solitary confinement. Isolation from others and restriction of social contact can have drastic effects. According to the San Diego Criminal Lawyers blog, with Borcha and Associates, this isolation makes them 40 times more likely to commit suicide. Mental health issues are extremely common among prisoners. Prisoners may go into lockup with previously developed mental disorders and illnesses. They may have established treatment plans, including but not limited to medication, therapy, and support groups. A lot of the time during the transition between the outside world and their cells, these plans get lost and unrecognized. Not only are these individuals extraordinarily confused by transitioning to a completely new environment, but their support system completely disappears overnight. This can lead to the extreme worsening of symptoms quickly. Children should not be in adult prisons. Isn't the whole purpose of prisons rehabilitation? To teach offenders of their wrongdoings so they can re-enter society a changed person. But adult prisons were made for just that, adults. These kids can't do that when they are fighting tooth and nail to stay afloat in a place made for people twice their age. And how can we expect them to, when there isn't enough funding for enough tutors and therapists, the basics these kids need to survive? A main portion of rehabilitation is education and therapy in order to assist in the emotional well-being and healing of inmates. However, currently, with the lack of money going into the prison system, there are not enough funds to hire an adequate amount of professionals. A small number of teachers, therapists, and counselors are continuously being assigned an overwhelming amount of patients. They cannot all be properly treated with the same amount of care and attention. Children, especially in their developmental years, need this care to foster emotional and physical growth and are not able to receive it while in adult prisons. On another brain-related note that Amy brought up, the brains between an adult and a child are different.
The most important part of the brain, the frontal lobe, does not fully develop until the age of 25. It can take as long as age 30 for individuals with childhood trauma. This part of the brain controls decision-making, executive functioning, and impulse control. All things that play an intricate part in how minors behave daily. For minors who have a delay in this development, may find themselves acting without thinking of consequences. They may also have difficulty with empathy, which can make hurting others less impactful in their decision-making. Childhood trauma can also affect the limbic system, which is so important in managing emotions and regulating our moods. If a minor comes from a childhood where their needs weren't met emotionally, physically, and mentally, they may have difficulty regulating their emotions, which may result in fight or flight. This trauma response may look like anger outbursts, aggressiveness, risk-taking behaviors, intimidation, and gaining control through physical force.
As much as I want to speak my mind on this topic, I admit I lack the educational background to properly speak on this, so I contacted another professional to hear from someone who truly knows.
My name is Nick Litter. I'm a therapist and I have a degree in clinical mental health counseling. I come from a substance abuse background, which actually does quite a bit with the brain, brain development, the way alcohol and drugs can affect brain development especially.
I thought Nick's background was perfect for this topic, and so I asked him what the importance of the prefrontal cortex is.
So neuroplasticity, meaning that the brain can change as time goes on, is especially in that prefrontal cortex right up here. It's where a lot of that gray matter is in there. And what happens is with things like drug abuse, stress, chronic fatigue, things like that, it can really limit how much that it can all grow in there, which sometimes you see like a brain scan of a 40-year-old person whose brain looks like a teenager because they experienced a lot of trauma or stress because they were just never given that chance to grow. So that prefrontal cortex is kind of the last developmental piece when it comes to a person's brain. It's kind of changed over the years, but right now it looks like it's about like 25 for women, 26 for men. Before that, it's completely developed up here, which means that a person, can go a third or fourth of their life until their brain is fully developed. So that prefrontal cortex is called the wise mind or the decision-making mind, and that's when we think of like really in-depth decision, like things like essay writing or thinking consequences through impulse control. All those kind of things like come from that decision center there. So if I have my little brain model, so that's going to be kind of right up here. We have kind of two parts of our brain. So I take my hand and kind of do my model brain here, kind of the brainstem in here, prefrontal cortex up here. And what happens is someone that's in that fight, flight, freeze mode, a lot of stress, this top part of our brain is actually kind of like a flap that sits on top there, and it will spring up just a little bit, which means that the prefrontal cortex is no longer engaged, and now we're just in that reptilian caveman brain of fight or flight, stimulus response, just making sure that our body's keeping itself safe. Oftentimes then when someone's been through some trauma, you see that they're a little hypervigilant, which means they jump into that mode a little bit more often. So if you can kind of imagine that, like this flap kind of popping up a little bit, which means the whole brain isn't engaged at that point, which can lead to really rash decisions. That's see people that are impulsive, or they didn't think things through, or when we're in that panic mode, we're not thinking rationally most of the time. After about like that 9 or 10, we get really into elementary school. It really matters less what our parents say, at least for most people. And then it becomes our peers that matter the most to us. So that's if I do something wrong socially, then I'm corrected by the group in that sense. So when you think of like teens in that kind of setting, you gotta think who they're around. So if they're just around other teens that are engaging in these really negative behaviors, or things that at least as a society we deem negative, they're gonna learn how to operate within that system, which isn't necessarily the system that in the greater society that we operate in. There's gonna be a lot more people in that flight, fight, freeze mode. When you're under constant stress or under constant pressure like that, it doesn't give a whole lot of room for that brain to grow. There's not a really perfect solution there, but that capacity to grow kind of up here in that prefrontal cortex can definitely be diminished in that sense, because if we're just constantly under stress, constantly under that trauma, feeling incarcerated, or feeling trapped, especially during those really formative years where our behavior is going to be looked at by our peers as this is something I should or shouldn't do in that sense. We kind of fall into that trap there where some of these kids are going to be so stuck and have this one mentality that, let's say they're incarcerated for their teen and early adulthood years. Then when they move to, let's say, have an office job, their brain does not need to be as hypervigilant. So they're going to be engaging that prefrontal cortex less, more reliant on that brainstem, that really reactionary reptilian, caveman brain, whatever you want to call it there. And that can have some really negative effects.
I know I sure had a lot to think about what Nick said. Not only is the decision center of the brain undeveloped, but that makes it harder for kids to control their reactions than adults. Minors, biologically, are less capable than adults to make rational decisions and decisions that are not based on their immediate feelings. So why should we treat their actions the same as someone who is fully capable of understanding? Being in prison can literally change how the brains work of these children and forever impact them, long after they are released. Time in jail now means time forever changed. While brain health and development are two extraordinarily important topics to discuss when referring to youth imprisonment, they aren't the only ones. Unfortunately, the reasons behind putting these kids in adult facilities can also be skewed. According to PBS, Is the System Racially Biased? Compared to white youths, minority youths are 2.8 times more likely to be arrested for a violent crime, 6.2 times more likely to wind up in adult court, and 7 times more likely to be sent to prison by adult court. We cannot ignore the blatant racism present within this country and how it might affect this situation. Even today, people of color face hatred, judgment, and stereotyping for simply existing. As racism is present in this world, that also means that it is present within the criminal justice system, the very system responsible for sentencing individuals to prison. I want to share a story with you about a young man who dealt with this systematic racism when he was only 16 years old. Growing up in Philadelphia, Josh Glenn did not have an ideal childhood. His mother suffered from alcoholism, beginning shortly after his father's passing. His school was overcrowded and unstructured. From an early age, in and out of foster care, Glenn had no support. He was surrounded by the drug scene, and through the course of many months, felt pressured to join in by the people he met. Eventually, he gave in to their pleas and began dealing drugs himself. He had several interactions with the law through his drug proceedings. In 2005, the year many of America's current high school seniors were born, Josh Glenn faced a troublesome situation. He was arrested on aggravated assault with a deadly weapon charges. Glenn, claiming his innocence, explained that the police based this on a complaint they received, not evidence. His race proved to the public, and apparently the courts, that he was guilty. No matter the fact, there was no evidence nor witnesses. From there on out, Glenn was held in jail for 18 months as an adult, although legally a minor still. He was unable to pay the bail money and, regardless of his innocence, was forced to stay. Glenn's perspective on the world changed during his time in jail. While he and other formerly incarcerated juveniles founded the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project, YASP, in 2006, a nonprofit organization working to end youth incarceration, Glenn changed his entire life around and made every negative 1,000 times better. Unfortunately, this past August, Glenn passed away from circumstances that are not publicly known at the moment. Although he may be gone, he will never be forgotten. The words he shared and the stories he told will live in our hearts forever. Glenn was one of the countless children that has suffered racism and faced prison because of it. While Glenn was able to turn his life around, not everyone is so lucky. I want to share one more story with you today, one that has stuck with me, the story of Alonza Thomas. Alonza Rydell Thomas Jr. was 15 years old and a freshman in high school in 2001. He had an argument with his mom one day and, like many other teenagers in their fits of rage, ran away. While he was away from home, he met a man who proceeded to take him under his wing. He housed and fed Alonza, treating him like a younger brother. But eventually, Alonza grew to miss his home life and his mom. He made the decision to leave for home. Dismayed by his decision, the man requested that Alonza do one thing for him as repayment: rob a store. Alonza, not seeing any other option and wanting to thank the man for taking care of him, agreed. So one night, Alonza took the man's gun, donned on a bandana, and threatened the store owner of a local convenience store. The store owner quickly acted, knocking the gun aside and setting it off in the process. Alonza was disarmed and tackled as he tried to run away. The store owner proceeded to beat him and hold him until the police arrived. In the days to weeks following, Alonza was arrested, charged, and pleaded guilty to armed robbery. He was sentenced to 13 years in an adult prison soon after turning 16 years old. In prison, Alonza suffered hardships unlike anything else. He was encouraged to go into solitary confinement to avoid the general population of adults. There, he was alone for up to 23 hours a day, without any fresh air. His living situation weighed heavy on his mind, and he developed numerous mental health issues. Another teenager on his block died by suicide, and every day after that event felt much darker for him. Alonza suffered great depression and anxiety, so debilitating that for weeks at a time he couldn't move from his floor. When he was finally released after 13 years, nothing could ever be the same again. At 28 years old, Alonza had not lived. He had never driven a car. He had never gone to prom. He had never had a job. He had never gone on a date. Alonza had a lot of living and learning to do as he attempted to get reacquainted with the society that had banished him. Every moment, from watching his mother cut meatloaf to waking up in the middle of the night, takes him back. He may be free, but his mind will always be trapped in those cell walls. Prison for so many is a burden that will never go away, and for children, it can be a death sentence. Children everywhere are being sentenced to prison, life away from their homes, their families, their opportunity to grow. Being in prison increases the chances and can lead to the extreme development of several mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and suicidal tendencies. There's not enough money in the prison system to support these kids and provide them with the resources they so desperately need: teachers, counselors, and general care. The stress and trauma of prison can also change the way a child's brain reacts and processes life situations. As well as, under roughly the age of 25, children are biologically unable to make decisions based purely on rational process and logical thinking. Racial bias and disparity is ever present in the world today, leading people of color, children of color, to be sentenced to adult prisons at a disproportionate rate. For the same crimes as white children, children of color are 5 times more likely to be sentenced to adult prisons. Something needs to change. We need to stop sentencing kids to adult prison. This is not to say that I am condoning the criminal actions of such individuals. I am, however, suggesting that while being held accountable, these children should be given the proper facilities. They should be allowed to repent and be rehabilitated. Their choices and mistakes should not condone them to a life of misery if they are capable of making up for their actions. At the end of the day, these are children, and we cannot forget their names. Willie Bosket, Josh Glenn, Alonza Thomas, and so many more. It's time to make it right, protect our children,